Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Atlanta Economics Club's May webinar. For all of you that have been part of the club for a while and have been to these webinars, welcome back. If this is your first event, I hope you find it worthwhile and you decide to come back for more. Just really quickly before we get started, some quick club business. Just a reminder that board elections for the Atlanta Economics Club are currently ongoing. Hopefully you guys all received at least one email with links for how to vote and who's sort of on the slate of options there. The elections are going to run through the end of this month. And so, if you haven't received an email or if you haven't gotten a chance to vote yet, that's fine. You'll get a chance before the month is out. And I'm sure there'll be other sort of reminder emails along as we get closer to the deadline there, just to make sure that we get as many votes as possible. We'll announce the results soon after the elections close, and then the board will begin transitioning and start planning for the next season. A lot of aspirations for where we want to take things in the fall of this year and the spring of next year, particularly as it relates to like getting back into the in-person events. So with that out of the way, I just wanted to briefly introduce our speaker. So today we have Kim Adamo, who is the Chief of Analytics at DAT Freight and Analytics, where he's responsible for driving new product development, customer engagement, and industry analysis. Before joining DAT, Adamo led pricing and decision science teams at FedEx Logistics. During his tenure in the industry, he built innovative pricing and forecasting models, leveraging internal and external data sources to improve internal decision-making and increase profitability. Ken's been quoted in the Wall Street Journal and many other trade publications as a leading voice on freight market trends. He leads a team of market experts who study every facet of the logistics industry to bring the best available insight to customers. Before his career in logistics, Adamo worked in pricing and analytics at a deregulated energy provider. He has a bachelor's degree in finance from the University of Akron, lives in Northeast Ohio with his wife and four children now. So welcome, Ken. And again, thank you very much for joining. It's not every day that we can have somebody that's willing to join these kind of talks right after the birth of a child. So we're very glad to have you here.
I appreciate it. I'm actually just hiding in my basement, so this is a little bit of a reprieve from
enjoy
diaper duty
before
for the
storm
next
comes.
time. Exactly.
For those of you that are in the audience that know me, I have a pretty extensive background on the logistics side of things. I worked for UPS for a long time, doing sort of predictive analytics there, and I worked at FreightWaves in the trucking and logistics sector, so I'm pretty well familiar with it. And so we're just going to have a discussion on where you think things are in the trucking industry. I mean, it's been for those that pay attention to inflation and some of the drivers behind inflation, there was a lot of focus on trucking in 2020 and 2021 as rates began to really surge in that industry. But it feels like things are reversing. So I was just wondering if you could start by just giving me just very high level, where do you see the trucking industry and the freight industry right now?
I mean, so I think we're struggling, to avoid too many cliches, we're struggling to find what that new normal is. The market was always going to correct back on its typical cycle after the COVID buildup. I think what we didn't expect, intersecting with that, is the broader macroeconomic condition softening and inflation running amok a bit over the last 18 to 24 months. So for those less familiar, the freight cycle runs in that 18 to 24 month span. What happens? There's not enough trucks, which drives rates up. The attractive rates drives a bunch of capacity providers to buy a bunch of trucks. They buy way too many trucks. What happens when you buy too many trucks? It drives the prices down. Those trucks exit, prices go back up. The cycle begins anew, and that's pretty much happened every 1.5 to 3 years. The cycle used to be a bit longer since trucking deregulated in 1980. So I don't suspect that will change anytime soon. But we're sitting at the very present moment, seemingly at the bottom of the COVID era cycle, is how I would describe it.
Okay. And so, we've gotten to the point where this year it looks like rates have been coming down, pretty noticeably after sort of peaking, in 2021 at the sort of and it's also sort of, I mean, it really coincides with sort of peak goods demand in the broader macro economy, right? Like there's a real surge in late 2020 through 2021, just in like, consumer appetite for goods, business investment in for goods and things like that, which drives a lot of the demand side. But you're right, like as sort of the macro economy begins to take a hold, and you see that kind of demand die down, there's less demand there, and so rates we expect start to come are starting to creep down as a result. I'm wondering, from your perspective, like, do you feel like some of the bottlenecks around the trucking industry have returned to pre-pandemic conditions? Or are we still finding like delays in the trucking industry in terms of like how quick it is to get things from one end to the other throughout the economy? Just a sense on like how congested the supply chain still is, because one of the big stories is just how supply chain disruptions sort of led to a lot of these problems.
Yeah.
So just your
So
sense there.
I think the more flexible modes have returned to close to pre-pandemic efficiency. So over the road truckload was mightily disrupted due to COVID because shippers changed their patterns. They had whole production facilities shut down during COVID, or they had part suppliers shift. All of that wreaks havoc on an in and outbound network, right? A hub and, imagine if you were to draw a parallel to the airline industry. Imagine if ATL shut down its Delta operations for a week because all the Delta workers got COVID. So they had to route everything through Minneapolis, Detroit, and other airports. That would cause a lot, even though the same amount of people were flying, that would cause quite a mighty disruption to their network. And it wasn't that extreme. I just use that to illustrate it. So the flexible modes have largely returned. And what I consider flexible, with over the road being the most flexible and then working its way back to things like drayage, intermodal, being a little more rigid. So, and then we get into the ocean component of it. There was a lot made about the ocean congestion, especially in Southern California during COVID. That's largely resolved. We're still seeing in pockets issues with parts availability and some ocean reconfiguring. But I think a lot of what I'm hearing there from a chatter perspective is related to cost, not so much service at the moment. So if you rewind 18 to 24 months, everyone's really worried about just getting the product, right? People are chartering entire vessels. They're putting shipping containers on the deck of bulk vessels, right, just to get stuff moved. And now I think you're seeing a more return to being more price conscious, perhaps even starting to slow things down a little bit to take maximum advantage of the soft conditions.
I mean, West Coast port sort of congestion, I think, was really a fairly large story, sort of towards the tail end of 2020 through 2021. But it's a broader story than that, right? I mean, like the West Coast ports, number one, they're very sensitive to sort of U.S.-China trade relations. So as before the pandemic, but there was conflict between the U.S. and China on trade lanes. They're also very susceptible to just labor stoppages and things like that. I mean, the West Coast ports just got finished working through another one of these kind of labor stoppages out of there. I'm wondering if you see any evidence that sort of shippers are beginning to more permanently shift away from West Coast ports in favor of some of the other areas in the country. In particular, just kind of thinking about like the Gulf ports or like the East Coast ports, whether or not you're seeing more trucking activity, heading out of those markets as a result of just like more trade flowing that way and away from the West Coast.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and it's a culmination of many long and short-term things, right? The widening of the Panama Canal, the dredging of East Coast ports like Savannah to add more infrastructure. All of those things contributed to the fact that shippers were able to move. I mean, there were 3 months last year, maybe 4, where LA Long Beach wasn't the largest port complex as a percentage of import volumes. I think New York overtook it for those couple months. I think they're back on top now. I may be misspeaking, but that optionality has been key. Now, I think what we need to keep in mind, and this is your area of expertise, I believe, the inshore apparatus doesn't exist with quite the same level of robustness that we have, especially for e-commerce fueling shipments. in Southern California. So it's a little more difficult to get things into inland networks from Savannah to Atlanta and then disperse than it is. That's a pretty well-oiled machine when it's working to go from SoCal inland and then distribute eastbound. So those are the things that I think will need to be solved to have more of a wholesale shift east. But that was definitely trending that way before COVID, and I suspect it will continue, if for no other reason than diversification.
That's right. And I mean, from my perspective, I'm on the warehousing side now, and I mean, you can really see the buildup around these East Coast ports of just like trying to build up the kind of capabilities necessary to allow for this kind of flow to go more smoothly. And so, I mean, Savannah, relative to its size, it's probably the fastest growing sort of industrial real estate market. So, I mean, basically, as fast as they construct a lot of new warehouses, but also as fast as they put new warehousing space up, there are people there looking to lease it out. And a lot of it's being driven by some of those same kind of desires. Like they want to diversify the supply chain. They'd like to ship, I think, more into some of these East Coast ports. But I think you're right that in some cases they just don't quite have the capabilities yet. And so there's pressure there to just kind of build up the capabilities. So what's the warehousing capabilities? What are the rail capabilities going in and out of the East Coast ports? And so it's very much still an area where development is still underway. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think I sort of agree with you that this is something that, number one, it began before the pandemic, and it's probably going to continue afterwards, just because it becomes a real risk for some of these shippers to be so dependent on the West Coast ports, right? I mean, it's because again, there seems to be always something going on either in geopolitical sense between the U.S. and China, or just in the ports themselves, just making sure that things are functioning as well as they are. Not to mention just the regulatory environment that's out in California versus sort of what can be out in some of these other areas. And so I would agree with you there.
Yeah, I mean, this is nothing new, right? Um, this is nothing new to kind of how these large importers have behaved over the years. I forget the exact name. What's the little island in, I guess that would be Southwest Canada, where they found out that you could shave a day off your ocean going time. Prince Rupert Island.
Yep.
You could dock there, put it on, I think it was a CN or CP line, and get it to Chicago day and a half, 2 days faster with less disruptions, and I believe even like a small tax advantage than going into SoCal. So this is nothing new, but to your point, the infrastructure moves a lot slower than the intent, unfortunately.
That's right. And I mean, a couple of years, I guess it was about a year and a half ago, we actually had the director of the Port Authority here in the Georgia ports just come give a very similar kind of talk to us. And most of what he was focused on was just like the different projects the Port of Savannah is undertaking just to enable more trade to go in there. I mean, it's one of the reasons why when you look at like activity in that area, it doesn't necessarily mirror the broad national trends. And so I mean it's a little bit different than what you see on the trucking side, but like on the commercial real estate side, I think the macroeconomic slowdown is having an effect here. But when you look at some of these East Coast ports, you're just like, well, I wouldn't be able to tell based on the results that are coming in over here. Like it's likely there's still declines in port volume of what comes in at the East Coast port, but they're a lot more muted than say what you find overall. And I think as long as they're spending money undertaking development to enhance their capabilities, it allows for that kind of performance even in sort of weaker economic environments.
Right.
So putting a little bit more focus on like the trucking industry and sort of where it stands in its own cycle. With rates beginning to come down, particularly like on the spot side of things, how do you feel about like capacity in the short term? I mean, typically, from my experience in the trucking industry, it's almost like demand turns down, and you find yourself fairly quickly in a situation where there's just more drivers out there than there are loads that need to be shipped around. Uh, and so what are your views on like how quickly supply typically, like the capacity adjusts in these kind of situations?
So I think it's a function of magnitude, direction, and duration in both directions, right? So when I mean direction, I mean are rates up or down, right? So we have the direction locked, they're down. How far are they down and how long are they down? So the 2019 example is a down direction, long duration, and rates didn't really go down that much, right? They were just down for a long time, a long period of time. So that was more of a slow bleed. There's other examples if you think about what spurred the 16 industrial driven trucking slowdown. It was more of a short and sharp decline that took a lot of capacity out of the market. COVID, effectively that was it was a demand side problem, but it kind of a short and sharp increase in the number in the demand, right? And then it catapulted the market. So I think you're going to see a lot of capacity shift around. I don't think you see a lot of capacity totally exit. There's a lot of places they can go that aren't the spot market before they. I think this is this fallacy that trucks are going to be parked everywhere, right? Your local TA is going to have 15 abandoned trucks. This is not necessarily the case. They go lease on with bigger fleets. They go become company drivers and sell their truck. You're seeing more and more. There was just an article in one of the trucking trade publications about the increase in private fleets, right? These are great times to snag bargains if you're a shipper that operates a private fleet, because you can grab a truck and a driver, right, all in one swoop, and that takes capacity out of the spot market. So we are oversupplied. There's no doubt about it right now. How long do we remain oversupplied? I think it depends. If we don't see a seasonal bump in the next 3 or 4 weeks heading into the 4th of July, I think it's gonna be more of a short and sharp. If we see some seasonality return and middle about over the summer, then capacity will probably need to exit through the end of the year. And I'd be looking for Christmas before we start to see a meaningful reversion in the market.
Yep. Now, is that does that hold true across all the different sort of types of trucking that are out there, or do specialized trucking fare a little bit better than say like your average generic sort of drive-in um, mode?
Yeah, flatbed surprisingly overperforming right now. So the specialty truck types, a lot of that's commercial, like commercial private sector construction that's driving some of that.
Okay.
Um, Certainly not private residences. That's slowed down considerably with interest rates. But look, I mean, there's less of a fungible. They're not as fungible, right? A dry van owner operator can go lease on with like a Landstar or something like that tomorrow, right? As long as the trailer's newer and all their equipment's fine, they can just go do that. You don't see as much of that moving around with flatbed. Now, ironically, I know Landstar operates a number of predominantly flatbed agent within their fleets, but it's just not as typical. So flatbed's doing better than the other two, but by no means are these rates sustainable for them long term.
Yeah, I mean it's I think this the single family residential construction sector is probably not doing as well. But there's there's an awful lot of construction going on the commercial side of things. Like
Oh
number
yeah.
one, like multifamily, like apartment construction is still pretty robust. But then other kind of commercial real estate, particularly in my sector, like the industrial warehousing space, always looking for some free construction workers to help put some of these warehouses up here. Um, and so,
And yeah, those are good industries that serve the flatbed markets, and it's also an indicator, right? When you build a house, what else do you buy? Patio furniture, fixtures. A lot of that stuff comes on a dry van. I mean,
yep,
not literally, like what I mean, I'm not trying to one to one, but when you're building warehousing, there's far less ancillary goods that pull along with it. Um, so, like I said, I wouldn't say flatbed and specialty are killing it. They're just not in the dumps as bad,
yep,
unfortunately.
yep. Now, how do you feel about like longer term views of the trucking industry, as especially as it relates to sort of capacity? I mean, the demand side is going to do what it does. I mean, I used to always say that like most of the demand for trucking is just derived from just broader economic health. Like I mean, it's if the economy is doing well, then demand will be there. If it's not doing well, then there'll be less demand there. But the capacity side is pretty interesting. Um, you hear a lot of people in the trucking industry complain about there just always being a shortage of truck drivers. Trucking is an older profession, generally speaking. Like a lot of the people that are still in the trucking industry are typically older than your average worker. And so just curious as to like your thoughts on long term on where capacity is going to sit in this industry.
I mean, I see very few fleets that pay their drivers or their owners and treat them well have driver shortages. It's like, I think we need to be careful. I think that the first day that there was a tractor trailer, there was probably a driver shortage. That's how old that narrative feels. And I think over the long arc of time, there's going to be a disruption that's out there looming around broad scale efficiency gains, right? I think the ultimate panacea for some of these driver shortages, equipment shortages, the cyclicality of the market will be how technology can disrupt this age-old industry that has. I mean, look at airlines, right? I mean, if airlines operated with the same efficiency as trucking, you'd probably see 5 times as many planes needed to keep schedules on time, and everyone would board like Southwest, and it would be a mess, right? And those two industries deregulated within 2 years of each other. So it's just amazing how much more advanced, and quite frankly, neither of them make a ton of money, right? Operating ratios for airlines aren't great. They're not great for trucking companies by and large either. So it's not like there's a big profitability gap. So I think long term, there's a ton of technology even before we get to autonomous, right? Whether it's alternative fuels. I think you're going to continue to see length of haul shift, which is an interesting dynamic, right? So there could be far more or less demand. You can't ship a partial truck, right? You can't just slice it off and ship it. So what you saw during COVID was there were certain markets that the demand for the number of power units needed, the number of boxes, skyrocketed, even though the same weight was, or pallets were moving, because they weren't able to efficiently load them. Their load factors went way down. Length of haul shifted. With these big mega fleets, 5 to 10 miles average length of haul shifting can result in far more or less shipments needed. So I think you're going to see this. The efficiency is going to start to bite away at some of the long-term needs for capacity. It hasn't scaled, right? I don't know that there's any great data source on this, but if there was, my hunch would be you probably need this relatively same amount of trucks to haul relatively the same amount of freight as you did 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? And what advancement have you seen really that's revolutionized full truckload transportation in the last? I mean, prior to COVID, most people were still doing paper bill of ladings and PODs.
That's right. And if it wasn't for the pretty hard mandate, I think there'd still be people out there, using the paper logs out there.
Yeah,
But that's
trip
kind
packs. Remember trip packs? I don't even know those are still around. The little yellow mail things where you like drop your paperwork in there, so you get paid, and then you had in-cab scanners. Now you just take a picture of it with your phone, and get your paperwork in.
That's right. So that kind of begs a follow-up question as to why do you feel like the trucking industry has been so it's been so difficult to bring these efficiencies in already? I mean, you made a pretty good parallel with the airline industry, and that you can see pretty significant gains in efficiency there. But trucking is notoriously resistant against any kinds of changes that might improve efficiencies. And so just curious to see your thoughts as to like why that's the case, or what's keeping these guys from making the changes necessary.
I think about this question a lot. I think part of it is, I don't know, is there even a single privately held? I don't think there's a privately held national airline in the United States. So I think, yeah, when you look at all of I was even thinking regionally. I can't think of one that's like fully, but anyway. So I think there you have more transparency in the shareholders are demanding more of this, right? And when you look at like the JB Hunts of the world, the Schneiders of the world, things like that, these big mega fleets, they are by and large operating pretty well. I mean, they're implementing technology. C.H. Robinson, although not a pure trucking company, has spent like $1 billion on new tech. With the automatic. When I was at FedEx, we did this project to automatically scale the freight while it was on the forklift. It eliminated 3 operations, right? The lifting, the driving, and the scaling. So you can dimensionally weight freight on the way to the truck. So I think they're doing it. What I think the primary cause, and it's just a hunch, is that there's a huge long tail in trucking. An enormous amount of freight gets moved by very, very, very small fleets, right? We're talking we've got like 1.5, 1.6 million trucks in our fleet. Most of them are under 10 trucks per fleet. Most, I mean, the overwhelming majority are under 10. The majority are under 2, 2 and under. So I think it's really hard for them to adopt the way a United Airlines might adopt something. And even all facets of it, shippers aren't very advanced. A lot of them are buying toilet paper better than they're buying transportation. Right? I mean, these bid events that they procure billions of dollars of transportation are largely done with Excel files still. Whereas a lot of the ERP systems are automatically buying office supplies, energy, things like that, all get procured automatically. And there are tools out there where they've tried to draw parallels, and it just trucking and freight in general is a little less commoditized than some of those things, right? A megawatt hour of electricity is a megawatt hour of electricity, right? But FAK is kind of a misnomer, freight all kinds.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, when I was at Freightways, I think half of what we were doing was trying to platform different pieces of technology that we thought that people thought would improve. And adoption is tough. It's getting people to buy in to some of the technological improvements that might be out there, even if it's something as simple as like an app that makes it easier to connect with loads or something like that. Even getting drivers to begin to adopt that sort of thing is it's challenging. And I mean, you're right. Probably some of it has to do with the fact that like half of the trucking industry is just like these small mom and pop truckers that are out there. Because like if you look at like the parcel market, for example, which is the opposite, where there's FedEx, there's UPS, there's some regional carriers, there's like Amazon that carries parcels around, but they made pretty significant improvements in like how efficient they are, and they invest quite a bit in terms of like trying to improve the amount of gas that they're using when delivering, or the labor at UPS. A lot of it is trying to make sure your labor hours are under control. But you can see like the obvious effort to try and be as efficient as possible on the operation side, and then you go to like the trucking industry, and it's just like a lot of freight. You're looking around, and there's wasted hours everywhere, between how truckers park, or like how long they have to wait at docks for shippers to get the shipments out. Like there's tons of just sort of waste in that industry. That makes things a little bit more difficult than it has to be.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite story at FedEx, I don't think I'm oversharing anything. We went down and did a tour of the global operations center and everything, and I don't know, I just had like this idea of what it took to run this. You drop an envelope in a box in front of a drugstore, and tomorrow morning it's in Taiwan, right? Like there has to be some sort of magic. And I remember a project that year won like the chairman's award of like this major technological innovation was to scale pieces of cutout cray paper that they laminated for how long it took those flights, and they'd arrange it on this like real live action Gantt chart. It was like an old school library where they'd be like, all right, the MD-10 that's going to go from Memphis to Narita, they'd go stick it on. It's like a Velcro backed Gantt chart every night. They would do this. And then kind of the technology project was to replace that with TVs and a charting program that allowed them to do that electronically. And they had this trash can that they used that all the pieces of paper every night would go in, and then they'd pull out the Memphis to Anchorage and they'd stick that on, and the Memphis to Oakland and stick that on. And it was amazing to me that an operation of that magnitude was still at that time running on literally construction paper.
All my UPS in attendance are taking heavy notes on.
It's all gone now. I mean, I've been out of the game for a while. It's just like, but with 99.9% on-time delivery of the express product.
That's funny
in
stuff.
full truckload, there is no such thing. 2 9s would be like even for same day, to be what we would call like a wrong day late. So
that's right.
Never underestimate ingenuity, I guess, is the moral of that story.
I'm going to take a quick intermission here and just read some of these audience questions. I see we have a couple of them that have come in. The first one is just asking about the diesel shortage. Just asking how severe was the shortage of diesel? Did it play a large, small part in supply chain interruptions, or was it more of a non-event?
So like the actual acute shortage was very minimal. We saw some bulletins from Pilot, Flying J, Loves, and that mainly contained, I believe, into the Northeast New England area. Nothing crazy. There's some in like the Carolinas there for a little bit. Diesel in general, if you talk about like the macro, I don't want to call it shortage, but the disruption right after the Ukrainian invasion was extreme, right? I mean, cost to operate for a driver went completely upside down. I mean, immediately their profits were halved, and then as that was the freight market is bizarre in that the cycles look for something to kick it one direction or another, whether that's like a couple, like in as an example, in 17 it was the electronic logs, and then Harvey and Irma, the two hurricanes, kicked the market into this just tear that went on for 2 years, a year and a half. Here, the market reverted almost to the day of the Ukrainian invasion into its down cycle, because you saw diesel prices go up $1 a gallon and then even more. They were unstable, and then it's essentially at this point wiped off. Between that and the rate collapse, it's wiped off all profitability for most small fleets right now. They're running on fumes and savings. So diesel had a huge impact. It's a bizarre phenomenon, right? So in the very short term, in the spot market, a rise in diesel prices will drive down the base rate, and the inverse happens because most things are negotiated all in. So it's it all normalizes out over a 4 to 5 week period. But in the very short term, it just caused an immense amount of pain to the market.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting though, because like you sort of had this environment where costs are still, or at least for a time, they were elevated and rates were coming down. But you didn't really see a wave of bankruptcies in the sector this time around. I mean, there were certainly some notable ones, some notable bankruptcies that occurred like in the broader trucking industry over the last several months, but not as severe as what I think happened in say 2019, or in some of the other sort of weaker environments for the trucking industry. Is it that they just that some of these companies are still sort of living off of previous strength? I mean, because for a while it was terribly good for the sector and they were making money hand over fist. Like, is that just sort of sustaining them for the time being while they wait for conditions to improve in the sector? Because I mean, I think going into it, I would have thought that there would have been just like I don't know, some version of a wave of bankruptcies that came out of all this that I don't think really materialized.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of your former employers would have probably had you lead to believe that like it'd be just like Mad Max out there, and there's just Peterbilts lining I-95 north and south, right, from all these abandoned trucks.
No,
Um,
I saw the headlines for sure.
yeah.
um,
So I think 19, that was my last year in industry, and it was a rate and volume slowdown. So not only did you have rates in the tank, but I mean, the volume was very hard to come by. We were sending hourly folks home, um, doing things to just kind of really curtail our variable costs. Um, we were just the largest broker trade show in North America a couple weeks ago, and they set like all-time record attendance, right? So you don't attend those things if you're not moving freight, if you're not making money. ATA was pretty, TIA, ATA, and MAPS were pretty similar. So I think, yeah, it's part of it is the saving up. I think part of it is fuel prices have come down considerably. I think we're down below unless it's wiggled since I have some baby brain fog, but I believe we're below pre-invasion prices, if not very close. And then the volumes are still there. I mean, these things operate on a very small margin, right? So for the market to fully correct, roughly we would estimate on the low end, 3%, on the high end, 7% of total spot market capacity has to exit. And that's a lot. And it's certainly not good news for those folks who will exit, right, that have unfavorable cost structures. But you need to read past the headlines. It's not like tens of thousands of carriers are going to evaporate, right? This is an industry with hundreds of thousands of carriers. And if a couple thousand power units shift over to big fleets or shift to private, that's probably the extent to which I think the consequences will be. Now, there's one caveat there, is if we experience a 2008 type, or even anything remotely close to resembling 2008 type financial banking macroeconomic calamity, then I think all bets are off. Then you could start to see that 7 to 10% exit of capacity. maybe even more.
Yep.
But at that point, do you care if you left the fridge open if your house is on fire? You know what I mean? Like at that point, like what are we prioritizing in terms of what we're worried about?
Yeah, that's it's very. I just had a very similar discussion about the debt ceiling when at my current job. We were talking about some of the implications of it and like what it meant for things. And I was like, look, reality is if you find yourself in that environment, like we just need to rethink an awful lot of things about
Yeah,
about where we think the economy is and where it's heading. And the least of it is just going to be like about the leasing rates for some of these warehouses that are out here. We'll have much bigger things
exactly.
to argue about. I'm going to ask another one of these audience questions here. Can you please discuss the impact of EPA regulations increasing biodiesel targets, growth in ethanol requirements, which increases gasoline production at the expense of lower distillates? Diesel to crude spreads soared over the past couple of years, starting to come off only recently. It's boosted transport costs and which then filtered into food costs.
I mean, the TLDR of my thoughts on that are just it's not going to become cheaper to operate a truck anytime soon. I think that's what we just need to kind of come to grips with. It's going to be more expensive if it's a business you're looking on investing in or getting into or watching closely. Operating costs across the board, right? The price of tires, the price of the labor to change your tires, the price of a truck wash, the price to get scaled, all of these things are going to get more expensive. On the regulatory side, we'll probably look to California to lead the way. It's an interesting caveat, though. When I was in the industry, this was blooming and it's really accelerating now. We operate in a global business environment, and a lot of this change kind of, in my opinion, it has to come from within, right? It's going to be really hard for the government to beat the sense into us that we need for some of these initiatives. And oddly enough, or maybe it was just a surprise to me in my narrow-minded Ohio world, the European companies are really leading the way, right? When I was in the industry, it was the case, and you're seeing a lot more now. And now you're starting to see it spread domestically, where ESG requirements internally are rising to the board level or have risen to the board level. And it's just becoming much more, common. So a lot of these shippers are going to be pushing for more, and supply chain is ripe for capturing value in ESG. So what you're going to see is sustainability becoming a really big deal in the supply chain, I think, over the next 10 years, mainly driven, I think, by the shippers that are going to demand it. And not just token projects either. Like I can remember when we installed like one hydrogen fueling station in Southern California to meet a contract requirement. I think you're going to see like legit push for change because that's what's going to be demanded by the market. Where will it come? I think you're going to just see more efficient operational standards being put in place, clean fuels. I think once electric trucks are proved out, at least on the middle and first mile, I mean, that's right. And I'm sorry, middle and final mile, it's just ripe for using electric, things like that. So this is going to be, I think, a really, really big deal for the industry in the next 10 or so years.
That it brings up an interesting question I had about something you said earlier about just sort of length of haul shifts in the trucking sector. I mean, I guess my first question about that is like, how permanent do you think some of those length of haul shifts were? I mean, some of that I think you can chalk up to just like pandemic related noise. But the other thing is that if length of haul is getting noticeably, say, shorter, it does open up avenues for improvements using electric vehicles and things like that. I mean, one of the things the trucking industry will typically point to when talking about like electric vehicles is that it still doesn't really make sense for longer haul kind of movements. So if you're trying to move something across the country, you're still going to want to go back to diesel. But if you do have noticeable movements in sort of like how long these trips are, it's just what are your views on how that plays into just like the push for electric in the sector?
I think it's going to be really hard on what I would classify as the first mile. And the distances are pretty great, right? I think there's a lot of bad analysis that happens. You have to, one of the first things you learn when you stub your toe in freight analytics, in my experience, having done it several times and still to this day doing it, and then kind of bringing new folks up in my current roles, is you really need to segment before you analyze in freight, right? So segment by equipment types to study the dynamics, segment by markets. I think when you look at length of haul, what you might see is length of haul is shrinking, but that's just because short haul, is something I would segment out. It's just becoming a larger share of the total shipment volume. So I think once you bucketize it, right? Because what you're seeing is you're seeing long haul actually lengthen, which is what
Mhm.
exactly what all these shippers want to do, right? These shippers want to maximize the distance covered by the what they would call their line haul move, and then minimize the distance traveled by their what you would call maybe like your first and final miles, where in a perfect world they'd have a really short jaunt to some. I mean, in a perfect world, they'd put everything on a train, right? Train tracks would go everywhere they want to go, and they would have a really, really short dray move to the railhead and a really, really short delivery dray move from the delivery railhead. I mean, that's the absolute perfect world for every shipper. And it's always an express train, and it never breaks down, and none of that stuff happens. There's never a labor problem. But however far we move away from that, you incur expense. So I think you're going to see long haul continue to lengthen. Shippers are deploying more technology, and especially with generative AI and some of the new kind of cutting edge, you're not going to see people do like a big network study every 5 years anymore, every 10 years, even every year. I think you're going to see these dynamic networks, right? That seek to maximize the length of haul and the long haul. And the short haul, I think it's ultra ripe, to the extent that that's a term, for alternative fuel. I don't know if it's hydrogen, electric, a combination of both, but basically anything that has what I call like the beehive effect for trucking, where they're going back and forth to a terminal several times a day, or they're loading up in a terminal and making all their deliveries. Those are things that are going to be absolutely prime for electric and alternative fuel sources, which
So
will
do you
make a
see
huge
that?
dent.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think if they could get to the point where even if the shortest trips are kind of shifted over to electric vehicles or other kinds of alternative fuels, I think that makes a big deal on the environmental, like the ESG front. So I mean, is that where you think like the next big step is in the trucking industry, or are there other sort of technological advances that you think are going to move things ahead first? I mean, um, the running joke in the trucking sector is basically that like automated trucks are always like 10 years away, no matter when you ask. And there are we were at the point where sort of like automated trucking movements are taking place in certain niche situations. But just curious as to like where you think like the big technological movements are going to be like over the next 5 years or so in the trucking sector.
I think alternative fuels, I think network design in a more dynamic way is going to be huge. I mean, what parse through any publicly traded trucking companies statements, and the number of empty miles that trucking companies run is insane. It hasn't budged much. I was taught most everything I know which some could argue is not very much, about trucking from just a wonderful ops engineer who was at Roadway, which is based in Akron. A lot of folks have descended from that tree post Yellow integration, and then at FedEx. And he would, at every new class, he would walk in and put a penny onboarding class on the desk and say, if we can shave a penny off of every empty mile, it puts $1 million. I forget what the exact thing was he would say, but basically, like, these are all waste, right? Empty miles. Again, in a perfect world, you would pick up every single next delivery in the same exact dock space that you delivered. Perfect world, right? It's like when an Uber drops you off at a hotel and then someone else gets right in. Money. That doesn't happen, right? Average deadhead to pickup is not improving at a substantial pace. And I think it's just, there's a lot of technology that needs to be thrown at it. There's a lot of patterns on both the carrier and shipper side that need to change to make that. It's because what does the shipper care, right? Acutely, like short term. What does the shipper care where the truck's going next?
That's right.
I think a lot of things need to come together to change. And there's a lot of companies doing some really cool stuff in the space, right? You're seeing like essentially like faux LTL, where they're taking multiple partial shipments and comprising it into one kind of truckload and moving that. You're seeing a lot of other companies trying to do dynamic routing, bundling shipments together to give more of a network effect to a small carrier that doesn't have a network. Those are all technology I think are going to be really, really helpful, because again, to be fair, this will be the equivalent of an airplane landing in Atlanta and then getting on their phone. I mean, quite literally, right? And then they'd look at like the United app, the Delta app, the American Airlines app, and find into the next 150 passengers, and then they'd go fly there, right? Empty. That wouldn't, pardon the horrible dad pun, that wouldn't fly, right? So, but it happens in trucking. It happens millions of times every day. and it's happened that way since before deregulation, right? Except before deregulation, you were able to get compensated for those empty miles.
That's right. It's the big thing about or one of the big things about deregulation is that some of that compensation went away, and it really affected things. But you're right. I mean, there are sort of a number of from my exposure to it, there's a number of companies that are trying to answer this kind of question. It's just like making sure that or better optimizing routes so that when you drop something off, you have a load nearby that you can then pick up and drive to another destination instead of just traveling empty. So another question from the audience: what are the barriers to and timeline for autonomous trucking in your view? Long haul or port to warehouse, distribution center to endpoint, like those kind of movements.
We talked to a lot of folks on this. It's not my bailiwick, but I'm just super geeked out about it. To a person, almost every single person I've talked to, whether it's academic, industry, or just kind of enthusiast, seems to think that the regulations are going to be the hardest part, right? We are a collection of states, right? And I-90, last I checked, runs through several states that alternate in different colors, right? Red and blue, heading all the way out to Washington. So what happens when one of those states in an I-80 or an I-90, or I guess more pragmatically, an I-95 route has a different stance on what is or isn't copacetic for autonomous trucking, right? You see it now with states that allow triple tandems versus double pups, right? So you see those little pull-offs before you get into some states right on the turnpike, and they have to drop one trailer to go down to 2, or they can pick up a trailer and go to 3. So I think with something it's like nuclear power, right? It's the world's safest power source. Right? You know what I mean? Like, more people have died from cancer downwind of a coal plant than have ever even remotely died because of nuclear power. So I think people are inherently scared of it, which is going to breed tricky political situations. I think from a technology perspective, honestly, I think the long haul over the road, big wide open spaces could be solved in the very near future. From what we hear talking to these folks, a lot of this is solvable. The canary in the coal mine for me will be when big companies like UPS, FedEx, and DHL are starting to do fully autonomous airliners.
Yep.
That's the most, in my opinion, distant from the average person, right? Most people don't even think about the fact that FedEx flies planes and has pilot. I mean, when I was there, FedEx had the largest air fleet in the world. And I don't think people front of mind think about FedEx as, having these planes. As long as one doesn't fall out of the sky, God forbid, over a major metro area, I think that'll be. And again, I'm not up to speed on trains as much, but I also hear that fully autonomous train traffic would be another kind of canary in the coal mine for when this thing is imminent.
That's right. We actually had, I can't remember his position at BNSF now, but one of the chiefs over at BNSF come and give a talk to our group a couple of years ago. And I think that's sort of like you sort of have to cross that barrier before you get to like autonomous trucking, right? Because like an autonomous rail movement, you're not dealing with traffic. You don't have any interactions with just like with people driving that. And they haven't really gotten to that point yet where train movements are autonomous yet either. And so have to if we can't do that just yet, it's tough to imagine just sort of an environment where trucks are operating sort of autonomously at any kind of large scale, right? I mean, again, there's probably sort of niche situations where you can use an autonomous truck to move something from point A to point B. And even then, probably not fully autonomous. But the idea of just having like masses of driverless trucks or trucks that are operating with the driver in them, but aren't really, but the driver isn't always in control of them, just seems like it's still a ways off.
Yeah. That's also the most dangerous, right? Isn't that, and I forget the levels sometimes, but isn't like level 3 widely regarded as the most dangerous? Is when a person's sitting there and it's fully autonomous, and it's like, it's almost impossible to think that they'd be capable of snapping to attention fast enough to avert a disaster, right?
That's right.
but look, this is a phenomenon I don't understand. It's probably because I've only studied business in my education and not psychology, but uh, I don't understand why this is like a sides issue. It just seems like there's always like people rooting for this to fail. Like even people that have no skin in the game, like not people like that descended from a long line of truck drivers and own a trucking company. Um, it's like it's a needlessly political issue, I feel, at times. Because I think there's going to be a lot, and that's just like think of all the driver assistance features that the big fleets have access to that keep them safer. I mean, just think of us, right? Yeah, I got into my a relative's car that didn't have a backup camera or lane keep assist, and I like almost wrecked 3 times in the first 10 minutes because I'm used to it nudging me back into the lane when I'm not paying attention, right? I think the
Well,
airplanes are, they pretty much fly themselves, from what I understand. But
but I think that serves as a pretty good blueprint for how this plays out, though, right? Because if you look at, say, if you took cars, for example, like passenger cars, like we don't have fully autonomous cars, but we do have cars that have gradually become more autonomous as time goes on. Like there are cars out there that'll prevent you from shifting lanes without signaling, cars that will brake automatically if it looks like you're about to crash. And so there are these kind of incremental improvements along the margin that occur over time. And before you know it, you're behind the wheel of a car that you it really, I mean, you have to pay attention still, but there are a lot of the kind of tasks that are done for you. There are cars that park themselves, that'll parallel park themselves, like that kind of thing. And the same thing on the airline industry. It's not like you woke up one day and all of a sudden everything was just autonomous with a pilot in there. There's gradual improvements, and then before you know it, you're looking and you're just like, oh, okay, this plane basically flies itself now, except for a couple of points. And so maybe that's how it plays out in the trucking industry as well. Is that just sort of they they start with things where you can sort of have like a convoy of vehicles where one follows the sort of the lead vehicle, or you make other kind of improvements to what the truck can do by itself. And then, 10 years down the line, you're just like, okay, this truck is basically moving with very little assistance from a driver from point A to point B. My guess is you never really get to a point where a truck is driving, with nobody in the front seat there, and just moving goods around. That seems it seems like a very strange world to imagine. Um, but I certainly believe that we get to a point at some point where like these trucks are able to go long distances with very little kind of driver interaction with the vehicle itself, and it just kind of hums along.
yeah, and again too, I think that's maybe what's causing a lot of unease is that one day we'll wake up and all of like those little robots that in big cities are delivering people's DoorDash are all of a sudden going to be 53-foot tractor trailers barreling down Park Avenue, right? I don't think that's essentially at all what's going to happen. And I do believe we've taken this conversation a long way around the point. I think that final mile is going to be the absolute for freight. I think it's a weird like not paradox. It's weird because it's opposite. I think final mile is going to be disrupted by a lot of autonomy for small parcel, parcel and small pack. I think I don't know if it'll be drones. I don't know what exactly it'll be, but I think it'll be something. But that final mile for freight, even LTL, I think it's gonna be really difficult from an autonomous driving standpoint. I mean, you might have like a lot of autonomous features. You made a really good point where the driver backs up to the dock, pushes a button, and then some little robot unloads the entire trailer, like auto lumpers or something. I don't know exactly what it'll be, but that all seems there's a lot of yard work and all that stuff that happens in the trucking industry that's just a waste of time. Maybe that happens, but I think that middle mile over a lot of wide open spaces is what's going to be the most prevalent use of the technology.
That's right. I'm curious to see your view on just sort of like the cost side of some of this stuff. Like to me, when you think about like the trucking industry, and you're right, like it's not a very high margin industry to begin with, and so like efficiency gains that you can gain are pretty valuable if you can get them. Um, and so conceivably, if there were companies that were willing to sort of undertake the expenditure to make their fleets more efficient in this kind of sense, there's big gains to be gained on it. Um, but the trucking industry is also fragmented. Like there aren't huge players in the trucking space. Even the largest trucking companies, they only command like a few percentages of like the overall market. So I'm wondering whether or not like these kind of improvements haven't been undertaken just because it doesn't make sense for a single company to undertake that kind of investment. Um, because in the end, they're still only a fraction of just like the overall market.
I mean, why has Amazon been able to change the world? I would argue that it's two simple answers. One, they didn't have to make money for the better part of 20 years. And then they made AWS, which became an endless font of cash flow.
That's right.
So when you're a large trucking company and you're, spending $9 billion to make $9.5 billion of revenue,
Right.
it's hard to do these things. I mean, it is difficult. And I think, again, we've tortured the airline analogy, so this will be my last point on it. I think they have been largely slightly more unprofitable than trucking because these have become necessities for them, some of these technological improvements, right? So they have taken the profitability hit to invest in it, even though no one's technically willing to pay for it. It just becomes table stakes before, like, you just expect that your boarding pass is digital now. That's not that new of a technology, right? You can change your flight from the app and do all of these things. Like, you can't, again, you're lucky if you get an email for a freight delivery nowadays. Most days the paperwork's coming with the driver.
That's right.
So it's these low margin industries innovate slowly because they don't have the money to go. Where's the next Amazon of trucking that's going to lose money for 10 years, like lose a lot of money, and then come out on the other end of it completely rethinking the problem? I mean,
Yeah,
we're
I
already
agree.
seeing, like, what there's gonna be, like, whenever this latest autonomous guy ends up in jail, he's going to be like the third or fourth freight tech person to basically find out the emperor had no clothes at the end of the day.
That's right. Well, we're getting up close to the top of the hour here, and I do want to be respectful of your time, especially considering your current conditions here. So I just wanted to say thanks a ton for joining us here. This is very informative kind of stuff, and I love talking transportation with anybody who can who can do this kind of
Same.
stuff. It's not every day that I get a chance to talk about the trucking industry or any of these kind of things that used to be my life at one point in time. So again, thanks a bunch for this. Fantastic kind of information there. And for the members that are out there, again, just a quick reminder: elections ongoing through the end of this month. Look out for emails about that. You should have already gotten one, but in case you haven't, there'll be more to come. And thanks again, Kim. Fantastic stuff.
All right. Thanks for having me. Have a great day.